Welcome back, friends. Welcome to the Health Bite podcast, the podcast where I offer small, essential nutrients to greater physical, mental, emotional, and professional health and well-being. I'm your host, Dr. Adrienne Youdim. I'm a triple board certified internist, obesity medicine, and physician nutrition specialist. And I've learned in working with patients and clients for nearly 20 years that good nutrition is not just about the food that you eat, but all the ways in which we can nourish ourselves, mind, body, and soul. This week, I am really excited to have a special guest. I have with me Gretchen Zimmermann. She is a registered dietitian that specializes in obesity and diabetes management. She has been working in this area and in the healthcare space for over 15 years. She currently serves as the VP of Clinical Strategy at Vida Health. Gretchen, it's so great to have you.
Great. Thank you, Adrienne. I'm happy to be here. Thanks
Well,
for
I think this is the absolute perfect time to have you and someone with your expertise because GLP-1s have exploded through the roof. So many people are using these medications right now. Often people are getting these medications not by obesity medicine specialists like myself. Their dermatologist is prescribing it, the rheumatologist is prescribing it, and they're not working with people like you who are savvy in the nutritional requirements and considerations for these drugs, and it's causing problems in our patients.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know about you, you'd probably agree, but working in this field for so long, I have never seen anything as exciting and impactful as GLP-1s and kind of how they've come to market and really have just changed the entire face of obesity and how we think about obesity is more so now it being acknowledged as a disease, a chronic condition versus just a choice, right? Over the last year and a half, we've seen that. And as a healthcare provider, as a registered dietitian with nutrition, of course, being one of the key components, it's something I'm really excited about. But yes, to your point, there is such demand like we've never seen before, and people are kind of doing anything and everything to get access to these medications, and they are getting access. Yes, there are a lot of concerns around that.
I echo your sentiments completely as a physician who's been working in this space for almost 20 years. The ability to have drugs that actually help patients and are doing so in such a great way. I mean, these drugs, while I think the lay press and maybe our influencers have kind of spotlighted downsides or maybe even created problems that don't even exist with these drugs. So there's a lot of like press that's not well informed. But we know that these drugs really are impactful, that they're doing great things, but they need to be used in the right way. And to me, the critical piece of using it in the right way, in addition to the right candidate and dosing it properly, is proper nutrition. And there is a right and wrong way of eating on these drugs. So I want to start by asking you what you think, what do you think is the most critical downfall in terms of how people are eating on these drugs and how it can impact their long-term health?
Yeah, so there are certainly a few that I'd love to highlight. I think the first one that comes to mind, and probably the one that we hear about most, is um, this loss of lean body mass that happens when patients are on these medications, and we see rapid weight loss, and they're losing not only weight, but of course, muscle mass as well. And while that is normal to a certain extent, right? I've worked in bariatrics as well, and we certainly do see patients are not just losing fat, of course, they're losing muscle mass. But as much as we can, if we can mitigate some of that loss with nutrition and physical activity, that's what we should be doing, right? And so, yes, there are certain things that we should be focusing on. Protein has kind of become this the superstar nutrient and the one with all of the buzz now. And I can't say I'm, not entirely relieved after this overfixation on carbohydrates over the last few years, but protein is important. And I think you've probably seen this as well. And we've talked about this before, but things tend to swing, right? Kind of thinking about a pendulum from one end to the other. And so now there's really this focus on protein, but there's a good reason to focus on protein. Because it does help to sustain some of that muscle mass as we are losing weight. It also has other impacts on the gut and hormone signaling and kind of triggering the release of some of that. And I'm sorry, GLP-1 as well. So there's lots of important pieces to the protein puzzle. Speaking of the pendulum swinging in the other direction, I do think that people are consuming more than they probably need to. Your body can only absorb a certain amount, say 20 to 40 grams a meal. The rest of it we're going to pee out. We call it very expensive urine, right? Because protein is expensive. And so I think, that's really where the role of a registered dietitian comes into play, is really working with patients to make the right choices when they are dealing with things like side effects and reduce appetite, especially as they are starting these medications.
Yeah, there's so much there. So I want to really like unpack all of this because I think we could spend over an hour talking about just your point number one.
Yeah.
The first thing I want to just clarify is the point that you make that when people lose weight, they lose fat and they lose muscle. This is a function of weight loss, as both of us have experienced with bariatric surgery. People lose muscle after bariatric surgery, not because of the surgery per se, but because it's an effective modality for weight loss. And any effective modality for weight loss, be it bariatric surgery, be it medications or anti-obesity medication, it will cause a loss of muscle mass as well as fat. What you're saying is, though, that we can kind of direct that loss to more fat, less muscle loss, which is what we want to do. We don't want to lose muscle, and we can't completely prevent that, but we can to a certain degree with the way that we eat. And protein is very important to that. Two things you brought up that I want you to give us some more information on. Number one is, what do you tell people who have such a loss in appetite that they just can't get adequate protein in? Or I'm sure you've also heard this, some people just have like an aversion. They're like, I just can't eat meat, or I just can't eat protein. It's not what my body wants anymore. So I have very limited appetite, and the appetite I do have is not for protein. How do we manage that?
Yeah, and that is tricky. And I think it does get better over time, right? As people start to adjust and we're titrating them up and they're getting to that optimal dose of the medication. But certainly initially, this is an issue. For patients who are really, they don't have an appetite, under eating, right? That's a major concern. So what I would encourage them to do is focus on protein first. If that's the first macronutrient that we can focus on, we think about protein and fat and carbohydrate is let's focus on protein first. And you're right, it is harder for some people to eat protein, especially when they're just feeling full. Protein does make us feel full, right, in and of itself. And so there are some strategies and things that people can do. Certainly spacing out meals throughout the day is one way to do it. So maybe instead of 3 big meals, maybe it's 6 smaller meals where we're just taking in maybe 10 grams of protein or 15 grams of protein at a time. There are also other ways to kind of sneak in protein. And while I'm not a huge fan of protein shakes, like the pre-made protein shakes that you can get on the shelves, I think they do serve a purpose, especially during this phase. And if someone tolerates that, great. Maybe they can just make a smoothie. It's like with our bariatric patients, sometimes it's easier just to drink something initially rather than have to kind of sit down and eat a full meal. And while I don't recommend that as a long-term strategy, I think that can be really effective up front as people are kind of going through the stage where they're losing appetite.
Yeah, and you make a good point that know that things are going to change. So just because you didn't like it or couldn't tolerate it when you first started the medication or when you first dosed up or titrated the dose doesn't mean that you won't change. So being mindful of it, making it top of mind and a priority, and testing yourself down the line is helpful. I also agree with you that while I don't love the pre-made protein shakes, that using a high quality protein powder, one that, the ones that we have in the office are heavy metal tested and they're concentrate and purified, because there is also a lot of junk that you can get over the counter. So you do have to be a educated consumer. But that's a great way of getting in some of that additional protein. So I agree with you there. I want to also dig in a little bit into the side effect issue, right? Because there's so much
Yeah.
has been made about the side effects. And yes, the side effects can happen. But I don't know about you, Gretchen. I am using these drugs like I'm prescribing it like bonkers. And
Yeah.
I can count on one hand how many patients I've had where the side effects made us discontinue the drug. I mean, if anything, I'm very conservative. So if I have a patient who's throwing up all the time, it's like game over. I will not prescribe the drug. So this is not even me being tolerant of side effects. What I can
Right.
say is that I really, and I don't think I'm special because it's my office, but there
Mhm.
are ways that you can manage the drug so that people tolerate it. So it's not what you're hearing on like the Yahoo, on Yahoo
Yeah.
every day. So talk to me a little bit about how you use protein and how you found it to manage side effects in patients on GLP-1s.
It's a great point. I completely agree. I do think we as a society tend to kind of focus on the negative aspects of things like side effects. They are concerning, yes, and in some cases can be very concerning. I read recently, and maybe even in clinical practice, have seen really only about 30% of the time will patients experience a side effect like nausea or vomiting or constipation or diarrhea. And then, of course, we have people who just don't respond at all, right? We have our non-responders to GLP-1s. We have to watch out for that. But so I think that's the first piece. And I mean, you're the physician, so really the titration, kind of that slow titration and the close monitoring over time is certainly one way to mitigate some of that. And then the other is, and what we found, I'll just kind of say because I'm most familiar with this model, is at Vida, for our patients who actually do end up on GLP-1s, which is a pretty small percentage of the patients who come through, there's a very high adherence rate. So it's greater than 90% of the time, the patients that are going on these medications are staying on these medications. And that a lot of that has to do with how we are managing these side effects, the interventions that we're providing as it relates to medical nutrition therapy, prescribing the right amount of protein, making sure people are eating enough calories. And it's even beyond protein, right? Like it's all about fiber and it's about fat as well. Fat can certainly make us feel even more nauseous if we're experiencing some nausea. So usually there's some guidance to kind of steer away from that for a little while. Same thing with fiber, also slows digestion, may not be as well tolerated as people are kind of titrating. So it's really this holistic approach to nutrition where yes, protein is a key factor there, but then we also have to look at how some of these other macronutrients and nutrients have that same kind of metabolic effect.
Right. So higher fat meals
Mhm.
tend to cause more side effects, especially at the beginning. I've certainly seen that.
Yes.
Um, I'm curious, and I don't know the data about this myself. What have you heard about, or what has been your experience in terms of sugar? I've almost experienced certain patients having, we talk about like dumping syndrome with bariatric surgery. So this experience of like sugar, usually it's the processed kind, but sometimes it can be fruits, causing this like sudden excessive amount of diarrhea. And I'm seeing that with GLP-1s. Has that been your experience as well?
I haven't seen it as much, but I definitely think it occurs and it makes complete sense, right? And I think that's also another reason that when people are eating carbohydrates and some of those simple sugars, like you might find in fruit, that you also want to pair it with something like a protein or maybe a small amount of fiber to slow the digestion so it doesn't all rush into the small intestine and create that kind of diarrhea and the dumping syndrome effect.
Right.
Certainly possible though. But then I wonder if you've heard this as well. I've kind of seen it in the literature too, that these medications are not only reducing the food noise, but also reducing cravings for sugary foods. Like,
Absolutely. Absolutely. But there are people who it's not complete. People respond differently.
Mhm.
The studies show maybe up to 30% are non-responders even to these drugs.
Yeah.
So using some of these skills and tricks to help not only compliance with the medication if you don't have this kind of obliteration of the food noise that some people have,
Mhm.
but also to manage the side effects like you've discussed, as well as to potentiate the effect of the drug. So I do want to go back to what you were saying earlier, that that the protein that we consume also enhances the release, our body's own release of GLP-1. So if you are one of those frustrated people, and I laugh because you shouldn't really be. A lot of my patients are frustrated that they have any appetite whatsoever, and it's like, look, this was not the deal, right? The deal
Yeah.
was to suppress the noise enough to kind of take out that background chatter so that we can make the right decisions.
Right.
But it is true that some people are just not getting the results. We titrate, and they're not seeing the results that they would like. Consuming more protein also helps GLP-1.
It does, consuming more protein and then also fiber. So I think we talk so much about protein that we forget to talk about fiber. And fiber has the same effect, right? Especially certain types of fiber, like the fiber that is easily fermentable that you might find in foods like garlic and onions and leeks. And what's important about those foods is they travel through our intestine and they're not fully digested. However, they're fermented in our distal small intestine or our colon. And why that's important is because they change into short chain fatty acids, which essentially trigger the release of GLP-1. So our body's own GLP-1 as well as PYY, right? It has these hormonal effects, both protein and fiber. And I think that's why we also think and theorize and have seen in practice that fiber can help with weight loss, right? Now, granted, this isn't enough, right? Obviously, this isn't enough to cure obesity or induce drastic weight loss. But when I think about long-term sustainability and when and if people are going to come off of these medications at some point, I think when when you're thinking about the type of nutrition you need to be consuming while on these medications, this is it. Because I think that this is going to really support metabolic health long term. To what extent, we don't know, right? But when you think about the standard American diet, which is devoid in fiber, typically, average American gets about 15 grams. Recommendation is 25 to 35 grams a day, kind of depending on age and gender. We're not getting that, right? And so
Which
I
is
think
already still so low if you think about, I
so
mean, it's
low.
such a low amount. And I really appreciate you shifting the conversation because we do talk about protein a lot. I talk about it a lot in the office, but I am by no means this like keto, fan. So it is about balance. It's about recognizing that, maybe protein first, especially in those early days.
First. Hmm.
But you want a balanced diet, and not all carbs are bad. We don't need to lump, carbohydrate is such a, mishmash of stuff
Right.
because like Twinkies are carbohydrates, right?
Right. Yes.
As is, these high fiber foods that you talk about.
Mhm.
And the fiber is important to release the GLP-1. I'm glad you brought that up because I had forgotten about that point.
Mhm.
But it's also really important in people supporting their digestive health with these
Yeah.
medications. So we see with GLP-1s, some people get diarrhea, some people get constipation, and the fiber actually manages both of those things.
That's the healthy microbiome, right? Which we essentially destroy by eating all these ultra processed foods and sugary foods. And we do a lot of damage in that way. And so, yes, the fiber is really critical, I think, to establishing and kind of maintaining that healthy microbiome.
That was actually one of the points you brought up in the initial protein conversation that I wanted to circle back to. It was kind of in the corner of my brain, so I'm glad that you brought it up. Can we zone out for a minute and can you talk a little bit about the gut microbiome, how our nutrition impacts that, and how changes in our gut microbiome changes overall metabolic health? Can you give us a little bit of background?
I mean, it's exactly that, right? When I think about kind of the types of foods that we consume in the standard American diet, we're typically coming in short when it comes to fiber. And fiber comes from a whole bunch of different types of foods, but think plants, plant-based foods is where we're going to get our fiber from. So, of course, you have leafy greens and you have vegetables, non-starchy vegetables, starchy vegetables as well. And then we have fruit, which unfortunately has been demonized, I think, a bit by the low carb keto movement over the last few years.
Of all
It-
the bones to pick in life, like the blueberry, really? Is that what you're going to go after?
the banana, I mean, that's the one that
Right.
gets me. Leave the banana alone.
100%. And actually, I put a banana, I don't have protein shakes every morning. I do kind of periodically, and I always put a banana in there. So I'm a
I
fan.
do too, and I will
But,
go
we
squishy to sugary banana. Doesn't matter.
thank
It's
you, but we digress.
I know it does have a different effect, but that's a whole other. But yeah, kind of going back, right? I really like to center around the standard American diet and just what we're typically consuming. And so yeah, it's those plant-based foods, and I think that's what does have the most impact on our microbiome. So what is our microbiome? We have bacteria, millions and billions of different types of bacteria in our GI tract, our small intestine, our stomach, right? So it's important to keep those in balance. And that's when we start to think about probiotics and prebiotics. And, prebiotics are like the food for the good bacteria, and the good bacteria are the probiotics. A lot of times it's not just plant, right? It's also dairy, right? Yogurt is probably the biggest example I can think about, kefir, things like that. Naturally fermented foods that provide these really good sources of bacteria. Kimchi, right? Sauerkraut, those types of foods. And so those are probiotics, right? That's the healthy bacteria. When we don't consume enough of those and we consume more of the ultra processed, and I'm just be careful to say ultra processed, not necessarily processed,
Correct.
ultra processed foods, that's where we start to experience shifts in our bacteria and our bacterial imbalance. And then of course that leads to or can trigger some uncomfortable side effects like the constipation and the nausea, potentially, and diarrhea, right? Like just different imbalances. And so yeah, so I think kind of going back to your original question, I think it's like fiber is really where it's at, and fermented foods. When I think about the microbiome, just kind of in its simplest sense, that's where I would focus.
And this is where I think, the conversation around nutrition shifts from food is fuel to like food is nutrition. For a long while, I was guilty of this. I was in the food is fuel camp because I was exclusively seeing patients for weight loss. 20 years ago or 15 years ago, it was all about fast nutrition, dense protein, and so shakes and bars. And I'm still a fan of these tools, right? It's like we don't have to vilify it. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. It's still great, like we just said, to use these shakes, etc., to augment. But if we can shift our thought process a little bit away from just weight loss, and food is nutrition, relationship between the food that we eat and our gut microbiome, which is that good stuff, bacteria and fungi and all these
Mhm.
little buggers that live down there, which can
Yep.
get kind of gross if you think about it too much, but they're
Yeah.
actually there to help you, so don't go down that
Are.
rabbit hole. But if we can really think about that, right? Like this is an opportunity where what you eat can really either kill and annihilate that ecosystem down there, or can really support it in a way that we now know is helpful to cognitive health, cardiovascular health, mental health, and well being. Guys, we really need to take time and nourish ourselves.
Yeah.
Again, I get the whole fast food, and I don't mean McDonald's, but just, like I don't have time. I'm just gonna eat what I can, to get by. But This is such an opportunity.
And sometimes that's okay, right? Sometimes we do the best that we can with what we have. But yes, overall, it is an opportunity. And I think really the other piece to this puzzle that we haven't talked about yet, but it's also how we eat and how we think about food. And this really gets us into like the mindful eating and kind of when we sit down. And one thing you said earlier that kind of reminded me about mindful eating, one thing I always used to teach is when you sit down to eat, just insert a pause and ask yourself, am I hungry? What am I feeling right now? Am I physically hungry? Am I just feeling something emotionally? And I think GLP-1s are a really good tool for that. Like you said earlier, right? They give us that ability when they take away the food noise to just pause and put a little bit more thought into what we're eating. And so that's the first step. Certainly, how quickly we eat impacts our digestion as well. So, generally, we want to spend 15, 20 minutes at a meal and make sure we're giving our body enough time for our brain to receive the signal that we're eating and we're reaching satiety or starting to feel fullness. And then, kind of the third piece of that is back to the protein shakes and those really serving a role. But I think overall, the more we can chew and choose cruciferous fruits and foods and vegetables and nuts and seeds, like that's a really good rule of thumb when you think about how to choose foods that are going to be good for your digestive health and your microbiome. Drinking a protein shake is going to digest so much faster than a meal that you have to sit down and chew and process and digest. And overall, that really helps not only just with overall digestive health, but satiety and feeling, full overall.
Right. So
Yeah.
there's this link between the act of chewing and the signals that are being released to the brain to
Yes,
tell your brain that food has been received and we can shut off that hunger valve or at least dial it back.
that's right. Yeah.
What other nutritional considerations do you think about when it comes to GLP-1s or the significant calorie restriction that may occur with, with or without medications? I'll tell you, I don't typically recommend a multivitamin. I am with you on not wanting to create expensive urine. That's usually what happens. But with my patients with the GLP-1s, I think there's a gap in nutrition, and that's where I recommend it. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that, and then maybe you can tell us if there's anything else that you consider with your patients who are on these drugs.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because this is one of the other big ones for me. And I think there is definitely a risk of malnutrition and certainly undereating on these medications. And yes, that's partly what we're trying to reduce, right? A reduction in food intake. However, beyond a certain level, it's not healthy. I read somewhere, I don't know how true this is, but it's not unusual for patients who are on GLP-1s to just eat less than 1,000 calories a day, right? And like that is not enough. We usually say for females, it should be at least 1,200 calories a day. Don't go below that, 1,500 for males. And the reason is it's because it's really hard to meet your macro and your micronutrient needs if you're not at least meeting those minimum calorie requirements. And while more acutely, if this is happening over a shorter period of time, I'm not as concerned. But over time, as we're seeing rapid weight loss, we know people are not eating enough. And that's when you start to get into those nutrient deficiencies and the micronutrient deficiencies and things like iron deficiency and, magnesium. The B vitamins are another one, which, speaking of protein and animal foods, that's an important source of B12. And so when you have those deficiencies, then we can see things like hair loss. Hair loss is another big one. People who are losing rapid weight, even bariatric surgery, again, any type of rapid weight loss, there could be some nutrient deficiency there. Maybe it's related to iron, also protein is another one. And so you get the idea, right? Like it's just I'm trying to think about this as a long game. I acknowledge that when people are going on these medications, there is an expected period of time where they're going to eat less. They're going to potentially struggle with some side effects and their nutrition will be altered. But if we really want to help people succeed long term, then this is the stuff we need to be focusing on. biased or not, I don't know. I'm a registered dietitian, but this is where I think dietitians really have the opportunity to come in and play a very important role as a very critical part of the care team, the multidisciplinary care team with physicians like yourself and nurse practitioners and therapists. We didn't even get into mental health yet, but that's kind of,
It's
yeah.
important that the nutritional piece be incorporated. It's important that a registered dietitian who is knowledgeable to be involved. If your physician is not savvy or not giving you the time
Right.
or doesn't have the background to advise you. Because I think a lot of times weight loss gets conflated with nutrition. Just because one is losing weight doesn't mean that they're consuming the adequate nutrition and maintaining adequate nutritional status.
That's right. So the focus, exactly that, should be on sustainable metabolic health rather than the number on the scale. And this is, I think, what's going to set our patients up for success in the long term. Right now, the literature suggests that obesity being a disease, some patients might need to be on these medications for life. We do know some patients will want to come off. And so, if they're not eating enough while they're on these medications and they're losing that lean body mass, you and I both know that as soon as someone comes off these medications, they're going to gain the weight back. It's likely they'll gain that weight back. They're probably not gaining muscle mass back. They're probably going to gain fat back, right? And then, we just know metabolically that's not going to be as supportive for long-term health as that muscle mass. So it's like the muscle mass is gold. We want to do whatever we can to hang on to it throughout these weight loss journeys and as we get older and, really kind of throughout this whole process.
Yeah, and I just want to sidebar for a moment because I think, and I know that this is not absolutely where your head is at because you have worked with these patients for so many years, but I just want to make the point that when people come off these drugs, the clinical studies are showing that they are regaining the weight. And this is not because they're lazy or they don't have enough willpower or things of that sort. You've mentioned a few times that obesity is a disease, and I think even that notion rubs people wrong. But I think it's worth saying that when people gain excess weight, that the hormones change. When we try and lose weight, in whatever manner, hormones will change to get people to regain that weight. So
Yes.
the hormones shift to promote more hunger so that people are more hungry. Now, could you ignore the fact that you're starving when hormones are bombarding your brain? Sure, I guess. But it's not a moral character flaw if you genuinely feel hungry because your hunger hormones are going bonkers.
Yeah.
The point and where this becomes important with the drugs is that now you have a drug that's helping by offering an offset to that hormonal imbalance. This drug is actually a hormone that helps satiety or helps a sense of fullness. So if you've gone on a medication on the medications and you have lost 30 pounds and now you take away the GLP-1 that is supporting that satiety and the 30-pound weight loss is resulting in a hormonal shift that's bombarding your brain, we're
Mhm.
setting ourselves up for failure. So like you, I have a lot of patients who don't want to be on a drug forever. I understand that sentiment, but I would say that if we're going to try, that we have this realistic mindset and that should weight regain occur, like it is in the studies, you come back to your dietitian, you come back to the physician without shame, without judgment, recognizing that this is something that we would have expected and
Mhm.
that we help people get back, the tools that they need in order to make this a sustainable situation.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also think that shifting the conversation to more about overall health, reduction in cardiovascular disease factors, and improvement in cardiovascular and cardiometabolic health overall is really important. Because then it kind of, we know with some of these drugs like tirzepatide that you can get 20-25% weight loss. And that doesn't always need to be the goal for every patient. And you can achieve clinically significant weight loss of 7 to 10% with a good percentage of patients and see improvements in other biomarkers like hypertension and hyperlipidemia, and A1C, and improvements in quality of life. And so I just think that there's obviously, right, like there's such a fixation on weight right now, but I think it's also important to like reground, right? And like what are the real clinical goals here? Because if someone does come off of a medication, a GLP-1, and they do gain some of that weight back, maybe that's expected, but maybe there can still be enough lifestyle support or whatever type of intervention that we're still able to sustain some of those other biomarkers. I don't know. The literature seems to suggest that they go back to baseline, but I don't think that necessarily losing the maximum amount of weight loss always needs to be the clinical goal.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is a perfect kind of reframe of the entire conversation, which is as weight loss is going to drive many of these improvements in cardiometabolic health, the way that you have advised our nutrition and the consumption is also supporting cardiometabolic health. I always tell my patients that these drugs, we were talking about how certain foods cause more side effects. It's kind of like these drugs are slapping you on the hand when we don't eat when you don't eat the way like you should eat, right? It's almost
Yeah.
like making people eat in the way that is really the most healthful.
Yeah.
And if we can lean into that part of what the drug does, the fact that it is really trying to engineer us to eat the way that we think is healthy or that we know is healthy, that is when we're getting the most out of this medication. It is driving the weight loss, but it is also driving a nutritional profile that is supporting cardiometabolic health should you continue it throughout your lifespan.
I agree. Yeah, I love that. I think, GLP-1s are controlling how much we're eating to a certain extent. Nutrition is really there to control kind of what's built and what's lost and what's sustained over time. And so the two definitely they go hand in hand.
Well, Gretchen, this was a great conversation. You gave us so much information, so many important nuggets that I think are relevant for people who are on the medications or not. So I really appreciate you being here. And I agree that registered dietitians, as well as mental health professionals, and so many other ancillary health professionals are so critical to this work. How do people connect with you? How do people find out more about what you do? Where can we direct them?
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation as well. So a lot of the work that I do is with Vida, so Vida Health, but I also am pretty active on LinkedIn. So I do like to share a lot of information and kind of thought leadership around GLP-1 and the obesity space as a whole. And then I do have an Instagram profile. It's Gretchen Zimmermann with two N's .rd. So those are kind of the three different places that you can find me. And yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today about one of my favorite topics.
Yeah, perfect. We follow each other on LinkedIn, but I don't know that we follow each other on Instagram. So I'm going to head over
Do
there
it.
and find you. And again, thank you for your time. This was really lovely. And to all of our listeners, if you are on a GLP-1, maybe listen to this again and take notes. If you have a friend or family member who's on a GLP-1, send them this episode and head back over to wherever you listen to rate and review. Thanks again, Gretchen, and we'll see you all again next week.
Great. Thank you so much.